The town of Gray Hollow, Massachusetts, had been dying slowly for nearly a decade when Dr. Elias Morwell arrived in the autumn of 1902, carrying with him leather trunks filled with medical texts, botanical specimens, and a reputation that preceded him like morning fog rolling off the Atlantic. The textile mills that had once been the town's lifeblood were closing one by one, their skeletal frames standing against the grey sky like the rib cages of beached whales, and the men who had worked them now stood idle on street corners with hollow eyes and calloused hands that had nothing left to build. The women took in laundry and mending, their fingers raw and bleeding, while their children ran wild through the streets, too many mouths to feed and not enough hope to go around. It was into this landscape of quiet desperation that Morwell stepped off the afternoon train, a tall man in his early 40s with silver-threaded hair and eyes the colour of winter ice, and within a month he had become the town's most beloved figure, though no one could say exactly why they trusted him so completely. He spoke in a voice that was soft and measured, the kind of voice that made you lean closer to hear, and he had a way of looking at people as if he could see straight through to the broken parts of them and loved them anyway. He told the town council that he had been studying child psychology in Vienna and London, that he had worked with the most damaged and disturbed young minds in Europe's asylums and orphanages, and that he had developed revolutionary methods for rehabilitating children whom society had deemed beyond saving. He had secured funding from 3 wealthy Boston families who believed in his vision, he explained, families who understood that the future of America depended on rescuing its most vulnerable and transforming them into productive citizens, rather than letting them rot in alleyways or drown in the harbor when winter came. The council listened with tears in their eyes as Morwell described his plans for the Innocence Garden Home for Forgotten Children, an institution that would take in the orphans, the abandoned, the children of prostitutes and drunkards and criminals, and through careful study and treatment would mold them into scholars, musicians, mathematicians. He would need the old Ashworth estate on the hill, he said, the one that had stood empty since the family died of influenza, and he would need permission to build a walled garden on the grounds for therapeutic purposes. The council granted him everything he asked for without hesitation. Within weeks, construction began, and Morwell walked through town each morning with his black medical bag, stopping to examine children playing in the streets, asking their mothers gentle questions about their behavior, their nightmares, their peculiarities. He handed out peppermint candies and sketched their faces in a leather journal, and the mothers felt relief flood through them because someone finally cared. Someone with education and money and kindness was paying attention to their forgotten children. But Father Thomas Byrne, the Catholic priest who had served Gray Hollow for 23 years and had buried more children than he cared to count, felt something tighten in his chest every time he saw Dr. Morwell. It was nothing he could name at first, nothing he could point to as evidence of wrongdoing, but it lived in his gut like a stone. He watched Morwell one afternoon from the church steps as the doctor stood outside the schoolyard, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as he observed a group of children playing tag. The children laughed and shrieked and tumbled over each other in the dirt, their faces flushed with the wild joy of youth, but Morwell did not smile. He simply watched with those pale eyes, unblinking, his face empty of expression, and Father Byrne noticed that his hands were very still at his sides, not fidgeting or moving the way most people's hands did, but motionless as if carved from marble. The priest had seen that kind of stillness before, in the confessional booth, in the faces of men who came to admit unspeakable things, men who had learned to hollow themselves out so that guilt could not touch them. When one little girl, no more than 6 years old, fell and scraped her knee badly enough to draw blood, Morwell moved forward quickly, kneeling beside her with his black bag already open, and Father Byrne watched as the doctor cleaned the wound with careful, deliberate movements while the girl whimpered. But it was the way Morwell looked at the blood on the cloth, the way his expression shifted for just a fraction of a second into something that might have been fascination or hunger or recognition, that made the priest's hands go cold. The moment passed. Morwell bandaged the child and sent her off with a pat on the head, and when he stood and turned, he caught Father Byrne watching him. The 2 men locked eyes across the street, and Morwell smiled, a slow, knowing smile that said he understood exactly what the priest was thinking, and found it amusing. Father Byrne crossed himself and looked away first. The first 12 children arrived at the Innocence Garden Home on a cold morning in November 1902. brought in wagons and carriages from the train station, where they had been collected from various agencies and institutions across New England. They ranged in age from 5 to 13, a collection of hollow-eyed waifs with dirt under their fingernails and clothes that hung loose on their small frames, children whose parents had died or abandoned them, or simply disappeared into the chaos of poverty and disease that swallowed so many in those years. There was a boy named Thomas who had been found sleeping in a coal bin at the train station in Hartford, a pair of twin girls whose mother had drowned herself in the Charles River, a 10-year-old named Mary whose father was serving a life sentence for murder, and others whose stories were similarly steeped in tragedy and loss. The townspeople of Grey Hollow gathered to watch as Dr. Morwell greeted each child personally at the gate of the estate, kneeling down to their eye level and speaking to them in that gentle voice of his, promising them safety and purpose, and a future they had never imagined possible. The children stared at him with the wary eyes of animals who had been kicked too many times, but they followed him through the iron gates nonetheless because they had nowhere else to go, and the women watching from the street dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs and whispered that Dr. Morwell was truly doing God's work. But within 3 weeks, something began to shift in those children, something that the neighbors noticed but could not quite articulate, a change that sat wrong in the stomach like spoiled milk. It started with their obedience, which was absolute and unnatural in a way that children's obedience should never be. When Mrs. Brennan, who lived in the house adjacent to the estate, saw a group of them working in the garden one afternoon, she noticed that they moved in perfect synchronization, their small hands pulling weeds with mechanical precision, and when she called out a greeting, they all turned to face her at exactly the same moment, their heads swiveling like dolls on a shelf. They smiled at her in unison, wide smiles that showed their teeth, and said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Brennan," in voices that were flat and identical, and she hurried back inside her house with her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. The schoolteacher, Miss Caroline Hewitt, had 3 of the orphanage children in her classroom, and she reported to the other teachers during lunch that the children never fidgeted, never whispered to each other, never passed notes or made faces, or did any of the small rebellions that normal children engaged in. They sat perfectly straight in their chairs with their hands folded on their desks and their eyes fixed on her face, and they answered every question she asked with eerie accuracy. But there was no curiosity in them, no spark of wonder or confusion or frustration. When she asked them if they had any questions of their own, they simply smiled and shook their heads, no. And one of the boys said that Dr. Morwell had taught them everything they needed to know. Most disturbing of all was the way they smiled constantly. These children who had every reason in the world to be angry or sad or frightened, they smiled with their mouths but never with their eyes, and the smiles never wavered, even when circumstances would have made any normal child cry or shout or withdraw. Miss Hewitt witnessed this herself one afternoon when a boy from town, a rough child named Jack Sullivan, who was known for his cruelty, pushed one of the orphanage girls, a 7-year-old named Emma, hard enough that she fell, and struck her head against the edge of a desk. Blood welled up from a gash above her eyebrow and ran down her face in a crimson stream, and every child in the classroom gasped except for Emma, who simply stood up, still smiling that empty smile, and touched her fingers to the blood as if she were examining something mildly interesting but not particularly important. Miss Hewitt rushed to her with a cloth, asking if she was hurt, if she needed to see the doctor, and Emma looked at her with those blank eyes and said in a perfectly calm voice that it was fine, that pain was temporary but learning was forever, which was something Dr. Morwell had taught them. The teacher pressed the cloth to the wound and felt the girl's pulse, which was slow and steady, no elevation from shock or fear, and when she looked into Emma's face, she saw that the smile had not faltered even slightly, even with blood soaking into her collar. That evening, Miss Hewitt walked to the orphanage to speak with Dr. Morwell about her concerns, and she found him in his study, writing in one of his leather journals by lamplight. She told him that the children seemed unnaturally controlled, that their behavior was not normal for children who had experienced trauma, that perhaps his methods were too strict or too severe. Morwell listened with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, nodding occasionally, and when she finished, he thanked her for her concern and explained that what she was witnessing was simply the result of proper discipline and therapeutic intervention. These children had been broken by the world, he said, and he was teaching them to rebuild themselves into something stronger, something that could not be hurt so easily. He stood and walked her to the door, and as she was leaving, she heard singing coming from somewhere deep in the house, children's voices in perfect harmony, and she asked what they were singing. Morwell smiled and said they were practicing their evening hymns, songs he had written himself to help them process their emotions in healthy ways, and he closed the door before she could ask anything else. The neighbors began to notice other peculiarities. Mrs. Chen, who delivered laundry to the estate twice a week, reported that she often saw the children standing in the garden at odd hours, sometimes as late as 10 or 11 at night, just standing among the flower beds in their nightclothes, not playing or talking, just standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something. When she mentioned it to Dr. Morwell, he explained that he encouraged the children to spend time in nature as part of their therapy, that the garden was a place of meditation and reflection for them. But the most disturbing incident came when Miss Hewitt kept one of the orphanage girls, a 9-year-old named Sarah, after class one day to ask her a question that had been troubling her for weeks. She asked the girl gently, kindly, why she never cried, not even when the other children were mean to her, not even when she was alone and thought no one was watching. Sarah looked at her with those empty eyes and that fixed smile, and said in a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere very far away that Dr. Morwell had explained to them that tears were poison, that crying made the flowers in the garden sick, and that if they wanted the garden to grow, they had to keep all their sadness inside where it could be properly transformed into something useful. Miss Hewitt asked what she meant by transformed, but Sarah just smiled wider and said that Dr. Morwell would teach her when she was ready, and then the girl turned and walked out of the classroom with perfect posture, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor, leaving the teacher standing alone in the dimming afternoon light, with a cold dread spreading through her chest like winter frost. Behind the main building of the Innocence Garden home, separated from the rest of the grounds by a 12-foot stone wall that had been constructed within the first month of the orphanage's operation, lay what Dr. Morwell called his experimental botanical sanctuary, a space that occupied nearly 2 acres of the old Ashworth estate, and into which no child was ever permitted to enter for play or recreation, despite its name suggesting otherwise. The wall itself was an imposing structure, built from grey fieldstone quarried from the nearby hills, topped with iron spikes that Morwell claimed were necessary to keep wild animals from destroying his delicate specimens, though several townspeople remarked privately that the spikes seemed designed less to keep things out than to keep things in. The only entrance was a heavy wooden gate reinforced with iron bands and secured with a lock to which only Dr. Morwell possessed the key, and he wore this key on a silver chain around his neck at all times, tucked beneath his shirt where it rested against his sternum like a talisman. When asked about the garden by curious donors or visiting officials, Morwell would explain in his calm, academic voice that he was conducting pioneering research into the therapeutic effects of horticulture on damaged young minds, that he was cultivating rare botanical specimens whose properties might prove useful in treating childhood hysteria and melancholia, and that the children would be allowed access to this healing space only when they had progressed sufficiently in their treatment to appreciate its benefits without disturbing the delicate ecosystem he was creating. His explanations were always delivered with such confidence and scientific terminology that no one thought to question why a garden meant for therapeutic purposes should be locked away from the very children it was meant to heal, or why the wall needed to be quite so high, or why Morwell sometimes disappeared into the garden for hours at a time and emerged with dirt under his fingernails and an expression of deep satisfaction on his usually impassive face. The workers who maintained the grounds of the estate, local men hired to handle the heavy labor that Morwell himself could not or would not perform, began to report strange occurrences within weeks of the garden's completion. A man named Joseph Keogh, who had been tasked with repairing a section of the estate's outer fence that ran parallel to the garden wall, swore that he heard singing coming from inside the garden one evening just after sunset, not the playful songs of children at leisure but something far more unsettling, voices locked in perfect harmony, repeating phrases in what sounded like Latin, the same phrases over and over in a rhythm that felt less like music and more like incantation. He stood listening for nearly 10 minutes, his tools forgotten at his feet, trying to make out the words, and though his education had never included dead languages, he recognized the cadence as similar to the prayers he heard at Mass, but twisted somehow, inverted, the melody climbing and descending in patterns that made his teeth ache. When he mentioned this to the other workers over lunch the next day, he found that he was not alone in his observations. Samuel Morrison, the head groundskeeper who had worked on the Ashworth estate since before the family died, admitted that he too had heard the singing on multiple occasions, always at dusk or later, always in that same hypnotic pattern, and that once he had heard what sounded like Dr. Morwell's voice interwoven with the children's, lower and slower, speaking words that Morrison could not distinguish, but which filled him with an inexplicable dread that lingered for hours afterward. It was Morrison who finally gave in to his curiosity and his growing unease, and decided to look into the garden one night in early December when the first snow had begun to fall, and the world was quiet and white. He waited until well past midnight, when the main house had gone dark and silent, and he approached the gate with a lantern shuttered down to the faintest glow. The lock was secure, and he had no key, but there was a place along the eastern wall where the mortar had crumbled slightly between the stones, creating gaps just wide enough for a man to press his face close and peer through into the space beyond. Morrison extinguished his lantern completely and put his eye to the gap, and what he saw in the moonlight that filtered through the bare branches of the surrounding trees would stay with him for the rest of his life, appearing in his dreams and in the half-conscious moments before sleep, an image that he could never fully reconcile with the rational world he thought he understood. The garden was arranged in a series of perfect spirals, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse and shift in the uncertain light, and planted throughout these spirals were hundreds of white flowers, their petals luminous against the dark earth, flowers that Morrison did not recognize despite his 40 years of experience working with plants and soil. They were roughly the size of roses, but their structure was all wrong, their petals overlapping in ways that suggested something other than natural growth, and they seemed to move slightly even though there was no wind, a gentle undulation, as if they were breathing. But it was not the flowers themselves that stopped Morrison's heart. It was the wooden markers planted beside each one, small stakes carved from what looked like birchwood, and on each stake was burned a name in neat, careful letters. He could read several from where he stood, pressed against the cold stone. Emma, Thomas, Sarah, Mary, Daniel, Catherine. Every name belonged to a child currently living in the orphanage, children he had seen working in the regular gardens or walking to school or standing in their eerie formations on the lawn, and beside each name was a date that Morrison recognized as the day that particular child had arrived at the Innocence garden home. Morrison pulled back from the wall, his breathing ragged and his hands shaking, and he was about to turn away when he heard footsteps on the path inside the garden, the measured tread of someone walking with purpose, and through the gap he saw Dr. Morwell emerge from the shadows carrying a lantern in one hand and a leather journal in the other. The doctor was dressed in dark clothes, his silver hair uncovered and gleaming in the lantern light, and he walked among the spirals of flowers with the careful attention of a gardener inspecting his crops, pausing at each marker to consult his journal and make notations with a pencil. Morrison watched as Morwell stopped beside the flower marked with Emma's name, knelt down in the cold earth, and placed his hand directly on the white petals, closing his eyes as if listening for something, and Morrison could have sworn he saw the flower lean into that touch like a cat seeking affection, its petals curling around Morwell's fingers. The doctor remained in that position for a long moment, perfectly still except for his lips which moved silently, forming words that Morrison could not hear, and when Morwell finally stood and moved to the next flower, the expression on his face was one of profound contentment, the look of a man who had found exactly what he was searching for. Morrison did not wait to see more. He backed away from the wall as quietly as he could, retrieved his lantern, and walked home through the snow with his mind churning, trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he had seen, that there was some reasonable explanation for a garden full of flowers marked with children's names, that Dr. Morwell was simply keeping records of his botanical experiments in an unconventional way. But the image of those flowers moving, of them responding to Morwell's touch as if they were alive in some way that transcended mere plant life, that image would not leave him, and neither would the terrible question that began to form in the back of his mind, a question he did not want to ask but could not ignore, which was this. What exactly was growing in that garden, and what was it being fed? Thomas Brennan was 11 years old, and had been at the Innocence garden home for 6 weeks, when he decided that whatever Dr. Morwell was doing to the children in his care was worse than anything he might face on the streets, and so on a frigid January night in 1903, he wrapped himself in 2 blankets stolen from the linen closet, climbed out through a second-story window that he had been carefully working loose for days, and shinned down a drainpipe to the frozen ground below. He ran through the darkness with his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in white clouds, heading toward the town where he hoped to catch the morning train to anywhere that was not Grey Hollow, anywhere that did not have that terrible garden and those smiling children, and Dr. Morwell's pale eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone directly into the secret places where fear lived. Thomas made it as far as the bridge that crossed Miller's Creek, perhaps 2 miles from the estate, before he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, measured and unhurried. And when he turned, he saw Dr. Morwell walking toward him through the snow, not running or rushing, just walking with that same calm deliberation with which he did everything, as if he had known exactly where Thomas would go and how long it would take him to get there. The boy tried to run again, but his legs were numb from cold and exhaustion, and within moments Morwell's hand was on his shoulder, firm but not painful, and the doctor's voice was soft in his ear, saying that running was understandable, that fear was natural, but that Thomas had made a choice when he came to the garden, and choices had consequences. Lessons had to be learned, and learning required a certain kind of sacrifice that Thomas would come to understand in time. The walk back to the estate took nearly an hour, and Morwell did not speak again during that time, did not threaten or scold, simply kept his hand on Thomas's shoulder and guided him through the dark streets while the boy's mind raced with terrible possibilities, each one worse than the last. When they arrived, Morwell led Thomas not to his dormitory but to a small room in the basement that the boy had never seen before, a room with stone walls and a single wooden chair in the centre, and nothing else except a small table upon which rested Dr. Morwell's black medical bag and several leather-bound journals stacked neatly beside it. The doctor told Thomas to sit, and the boy obeyed because there was nothing else to do, and Morwell began to speak in that measured academic tone about the nature of communication and the problem of dishonesty and how the tongue was the instrument of deception, the tool by which children manipulated and lied and caused discord within the carefully constructed order he was building. Thomas listened with tears streaming down his face, understanding that something terrible was about to happen but unable to imagine the specific shape it would take, and when Morwell opened his medical bag and withdrew a silver needle, long and thin and gleaming in the lamplight, the boy's bladder released and warm urine spread across the chair beneath him. Morwell did not react to this, did not show disgust or anger, simply noted in one of his journals that the subject was experiencing expected fear response, and then set the journal aside and told Thomas to open his mouth. What happened next took less than 3 minutes, but would define the rest of Thomas's short life and serve as a warning to every other child in the orphanage, a demonstration of what awaited those who broke the rules, or questioned the methods or tried to escape the careful reshaping that Morwell had designed for them. The doctor instructed Thomas to extend his tongue, and when the boy hesitated, Morwell simply waited with infinite patience until the child's will broke, and he complied, and then with movements that were precise and almost gentle, Morwell pierced the tongue straight through from top to bottom with the silver needle, pushing it through the soft tissue with the same care a seamstress might use when threading delicate fabric. Thomas screamed, or tried to, but the sound that came out was wet and garbled and wrong, and blood filled his mouth and ran down his chin in thick streams, while Morwell held his head steady and told him in that soft voice that pain was temporary, but the lesson would last forever. But the needle itself was not the end of the procedure. From his bag, Morwell withdrew a small piece of parchment paper, no larger than a thumbnail, upon which was written in Latin script a phrase that Thomas could not read, and this parchment the doctor rolled into a tight cylinder and threaded onto the needle where it protruded from the top of Thomas's tongue, securing it in place so that it rested against the roof of the boy's mouth, a constant foreign presence that made swallowing agony and speaking impossible. Morwell explained as he worked that the parchment contained words of binding, that it would teach Thomas's body to understand silence as a virtue rather than a punishment, and that he must keep it in place until the lesson had been properly learned, which might take days or weeks or longer, depending on how quickly Thomas accepted his new reality. The next morning at breakfast, Thomas sat at the long table with the other children, his face pale as chalk and his hands trembling so violently that he could barely hold his spoon, and when he tried to eat the porridge that had been placed before him, each swallow was an act of torture that brought fresh tears to his eyes, though he made no sound because sound was no longer possible. The other children watched him with their empty smiles and their glassy eyes, and none of them asked what had happened because they already knew. They had learned their own lessons in their own ways, and they understood that questioning Dr. Morwell's methods was to invite their own education in suffering. A volunteer named Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman from town who came twice a week to help serve meals, noticed that Thomas was not speaking and asked if he was feeling unwell, and the boy looked at her with such desperate pleading in his eyes that she knelt beside his chair and asked him to please tell her what was wrong. Thomas opened his mouth slowly, reluctantly, and Mrs. Patterson saw the silver needle gleaming in the dim morning light, saw the way it transfixed his tongue, and held the small roll of parchment in place, saw the infected tissue beginning to swell around the puncture wounds, and she stood up so quickly that her chair fell backward with a crash that made every child in the room turn to look at her with those synchronized movements that had become their trademark. She backed toward the door, her hand over her mouth, and Dr. Morwell appeared in the doorway as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, and he asked Mrs. Patterson if there was a problem, if she needed assistance, if perhaps the sight of therapeutic intervention was too difficult for her sensitive nature. She tried to speak, tried to demand that he remove that terrible thing from the child's mouth, but the words would not come because she saw in Morwell's eyes that he wanted her to object, that he was hoping she would make a scene so that he could explain to her in front of all the children why what he was doing was necessary and proper, and in fact an act of love, and she could not bear to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she simply left, walking out into the cold January morning and never returning to the Innocence Garden home again. And she told no one what she had seen because who would believe her, and even if they did believe her, what could be done when Dr. Morwell had the support of the town council and the funding of Boston's wealthiest families and the trust of everyone who mattered. Thomas wore the needle for 3 days, unable to speak or eat anything but thin broth, sleeping in fits and starts because the pain was constant and the parchment seemed to expand in his mouth, seemed to whisper things he could not quite hear, and on the 3rd night he rose from his bed while the other children slept and walked down the stairs in his nightclothes with his feet bare and his face blank. He walked through the main hall and out the back door, and he walked across the frost-covered lawn to the locked gate of the walled garden, and though he had no key, the gate swung open when he touched it as if it had been waiting for him, as if the garden itself had been calling to him through that piece of parchment that still rested against his tongue. He walked into the garden and disappeared among the spirals of white flowers, and when the other children came down to breakfast the next morning, there was an empty place at the table where Thomas had sat, and no one asked about him, no one wondered aloud where he had gone, because they all knew, without being told, that Thomas had learned his lesson and graduated to a new phase of Dr. Morwell's treatment, a phase that took place in the garden where the flowers grew and the names were carved on wooden markers, and from which no child ever returned to tell what they had learned in that final classroom, where silence was not just encouraged but absolute and eternal. On a bright March morning in 1903, 3 of Dr. Morwell's most generous benefactors arrived at the Innocence Garden home in a gleaming black carriage pulled by matched grey horses, their arrival timed precisely to coincide with the moment when the children would be most presentable and the light would fall most favourably through the tall windows of the main hall. The visitors were Miss Harrison Blackwood, a railroad magnate whose fortune had been built on the broken backs of immigrant labourers, his wife Constance, who wore her charity work like an expensive piece of jewellery designed to distract from the source of her wealth, and Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft, a widow who had inherited a textile empire and was known throughout Boston society for her passionate advocacy for orphaned children and her willingness to fund experimental approaches to their care and education. Dr. Morwell greeted them at the door with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that money required performance, that donors needed to see tangible results for their investments, and he had spent weeks preparing for this visit with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to all his work. The children had been rehearsing for hours each day, their performances refined and polished until every gesture and word carried the weight of absolute precision, and Morwell had selected only his most successfully reformed subjects for the demonstration, the ones whose transformations were most complete and whose obedience was beyond question. The tour began in the music room where a girl named Catherine, barely 9 years old, sat at the piano and played a complex sonata by Chopin with technical proficiency that would have impressed a concert hall audience, her small fingers moving across the keys with mechanical perfection, while her face remained completely expressionless, not even a hint of the joy or struggle that music typically evoked in young performers. Mrs. Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and remarked that she had never heard such beautiful playing from one so young, and Dr. Morwell explained in his measured voice that Catherine had arrived at the orphanage only 4 months earlier, a traumatized child who had witnessed her mother's murder and had been found hiding in a closet covered in blood and unable to speak. Now, he said with evident pride, she had not only regained her voice but had developed skills that surpassed those of children twice her age, all through his innovative therapeutic methods that combined discipline with what he called emotional recalibration. The benefactors nodded and smiled, impressed by this transformation, and they moved to the next room where a group of 6 children stood in a perfect line and recited poetry in unison, their voices blending into a single sound that was beautiful and terrible at once, speaking verses from Wordsworth and Tennyson without a single stumble or hesitation, their eyes fixed on some invisible point above the visitors' heads. In the classroom, Dr. Morwell demonstrated the children's mathematical abilities by having them solve complex equations on the chalkboard, problems involving algebra and geometry that most adults could not approach, and the children worked in complete silence except for the scratch of chalk on slate, their calculations flowing with an ease that suggested not understanding but rather some kind of programmed response, as if they were machines executing instructions rather than minds engaged in reasoning. Mr. Blackwood asked one of the boys, a 12-year-old named Daniel, to explain how he had arrived at his answer, and the boy turned to face him with that same empty smile that all Morwell's children wore and recited a proof in a flat monotone, the words technically correct, but delivered without any comprehension of their meaning, and Mr. Blackwood nodded approvingly, though something in the boy's eyes made him uncomfortable in a way he could not articulate. The tour continued through the dormitories where the beds were made with hospital corners and the children's few possessions were arranged with obsessive neatness, through the dining hall where the benefactors were told about the nutritious meals and strict schedules that promoted healthy development, and finally into the library where a small group of children sat reading advanced texts in perfect silence, not whispering or fidgeting as children normally did, just sitting with their books open and their eyes moving across the pages in synchronized rhythm. It was in the library that Mrs. Ashcroft experienced the moment that would haunt her for the rest of her life, though she would never speak of it publicly and would continue to fund Dr. Morwell's work for another 2 years before her conscience finally broke her silence. She had been examining a shelf of books when she felt the weight of someone's gaze upon her, and when she turned, she saw a little girl of perhaps 7 standing in the corner, a child with dark hair and enormous eyes who was staring at Mrs. Ashcroft with an intensity that seemed to burn across the space between them. The girl's face was frozen in that same smile that all the children wore, but her eyes were different. Her eyes were screaming, and Mrs. Ashcroft found herself walking toward the child as if pulled by an invisible thread, drawn by something desperate in that stare. The other benefactors were occupied listening to Dr. Morwell explain his cataloguing system, and for a moment Mrs. Ashcroft was alone with the girl, close enough to see that the child's hands were clenched so tightly that her fingernails had drawn blood from her palms, close enough to see the slight tremor that ran through her small frame. Mrs. Ashcroft knelt down so that she was at eye level with the girl and asked softly if she was all right, if there was anything she needed, and the girl's smile never wavered but her lips began to move, forming words without sound, and Mrs. Ashcroft leaned closer to try to read what the child was saying. "Help him," the girl's lips shaped. "Help him, please," and Mrs. Ashcroft felt ice spread through her veins because the pronoun was wrong. Surely the girl meant help me. Surely she was asking for her own rescue. But before Mrs. Ashcroft could ask for clarification, she felt a presence behind her and turned to see Dr. Morwell standing there with that gentle expression he wore so well, his pale eyes watching the interaction with interest but no alarm. Dr. Morwell placed his hand on the girl's shoulder, a touch that appeared gentle and paternal, barely any pressure at all, just a father's reassuring contact with a child under his care, but the effect on the girl was immediate and profound. Her entire body went rigid as if an electric current had passed through her spine straightening and her arms snapping to her sides, and the trembling stopped instantly, replaced by a stillness that was more disturbing than any violence. The girl's smile, which had been strained and wrong, suddenly widened into something that showed all her teeth, an expression of pure joy that looked grotesque on her small face, and she turned that smile up toward Dr. Morwell with what could only be described as adoration. Mrs. Ashcroft watched this transformation in the span of perhaps 3 seconds, watched the light in the girl's eyes change from desperate awareness to glassy emptiness, and when the child spoke, her voice was bright and cheerful, and completely devoid of the terror that had been visible moments before. "I meant help us learn more, Ma'am," the girl said. "Help us learn everything that Dr. Morwell wants to teach us, because learning is the greatest gift, and we are so grateful to be here." Dr. Morwell smiled down at the girl and said that she had expressed herself beautifully, and he explained to Mrs. Ashcroft that this particular child, whose name was Rebecca, had made remarkable progress since arriving at the orphanage, that she had been prone to confusion and unclear communication, but was learning to express herself with greater precision each day. Mrs. Ashcroft stood slowly, her knees weak, and her mind struggling to reconcile what she had seen with what Dr. Morwell was telling her, struggling to explain away the terror in the child's eyes and the way her body had responded to his touch like a puppet jerked by strings, and she found that she could not speak, could not form the questions that were burning in her throat, because to voice them would be to acknowledge something too terrible to accept. The tour concluded with tea in Dr. Morwell's study, where the benefactors signed checks and praised his innovative work, and Mrs. Ashcroft added her signature to a bank draft for $5,000, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote, and she told herself that she had misunderstood what the girl had been trying to say, that the child's transformation had been nothing more than a shy student responding to her teacher's encouragement, that the rigidity and the sudden smile were simply the effects of discipline and proper training. She rode back to Boston in silence while the Blackwoods chatted about how impressed they were with the children's progress, and when she arrived home she poured herself a glass of brandy despite the early hour and sat in her parlor watching the light fade from the sky, and she did not allow herself to think about the way the girl had mouthed help him, or about what it might mean, or about what kind of help might be needed in a place where children smiled so perfectly and obeyed so completely and seemed to have no will of their own. The money was donated, the work continued, and Mrs. Ashcroft pushed the memory down into the dark places where wealthy people store their guilt and their complicity, and she did not visit the Innocence Garden home again for more than a year. Margaret Walsh had been a widow for 8 months when she answered the advertisement for a live-in caretaker at the Innocence Garden home, her husband having been crushed beneath a falling beam at the lumber mill where he worked, leaving her with nothing but debts and a small room in a boarding house where the landlady was already making noise about overdue rent. She was 34 years old and had no children of her own, a fact that had caused her great sorrow during her marriage but which now seemed like a mercy given that she had only herself to feed. And when Dr. Morwell interviewed her in his study and offered her a position with room and board, plus a small salary, she accepted before he had finished explaining the duties, desperate enough that she did not think to ask why the previous caretaker had left, or why a progressive orphanage funded by Boston's elite would need to hire someone so quickly. Morwell seemed pleased with her eagerness and told her that she would be responsible for the children's laundry, for supervising their evening washing and preparations for bed, and for maintaining the dormitories in a state of cleanliness that promoted both physical health and moral discipline. He explained that the children followed a strict schedule, and that she should not deviate from the routines he had established, that consistency was essential to their treatment, and any disruption could undo months of careful work. Margaret nodded and promised to follow his instructions exactly, and she moved into a small room on the 3rd floor of the estate that very evening, grateful to have a roof over her head and purpose to fill her days, even if that purpose meant serving children who smiled too much and never seemed to laugh. For the first 2 days, Margaret performed her duties with diligent efficiency, washing the children's clothes and linens, scrubbing the dormitory floors, helping the younger ones with their buttons and laces, and she tried not to notice the strangeness that pervaded every interaction, the way the children moved in synchronized patterns, the way they never asked questions or complained or showed any of the normal resistance that children typically displayed when told to wash behind their ears or eat their vegetables. She told herself that Dr. Morwell's methods were simply more effective than traditional approaches, that these were children who had been traumatized and needed structure, and that their unusual behavior was a sign of healing rather than something more sinister. But on her third night, Margaret woke to the sound of singing, faint and ethereal, drifting through her window from somewhere outside, and when she sat up in her narrow bed and looked at the small clock on her nightstand, she saw that it was 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. The singing was unlike anything she had heard before, not a melody that brought comfort or joy, but something that seemed to come from very far away or very deep below, voices layered in harmonies that were mathematically perfect but emotionally hollow, and she felt drawn to the window by a compulsion she could not name, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor as she crossed the room and looked out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full that night, and by its light Margaret could see the walled garden behind the main building, and she could see that the heavy wooden gate stood open, which should have been impossible because Dr. Morwell kept it locked at all times. The singing was coming from inside the garden, multiple voices rising and falling in that strange hypnotic rhythm, and Margaret felt fear bloom in her chest, like a night-blooming flower, cold and toxic, but alongside the fear was a terrible curiosity that pulled at her with invisible hooks. She wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and moved through the dark house as quietly as she could, down the back stairs and through the kitchen where the embers in the stove cast a faint red glow, and out into the March night where frost covered the grass like shattered glass. The cold bit through her thin clothing immediately, but she barely felt it, her attention fixed entirely on the garden gate and the light that flickered beyond it, candlelight that danced and swayed. She approached the opening and pressed herself against the stone wall just outside, listening to the singing grow louder, and then she gathered her courage and leaned forward just enough to see inside. What Margaret saw in the garden that night would break something fundamental in her understanding of the world, would crack open the assumptions she had carried about the nature of childhood and innocence and the limits of human cruelty. The children were arranged in rows between the spiral patterns of white flowers, perhaps 20 of them in total, barefoot despite the frost that covered the ground, each one holding a white candle that illuminated their faces from below, and made them look like small ghosts or angels painted by an artist who had never understood joy. They were singing in Latin, the same phrases repeating over and over, and Margaret recognized some of the words from her Catholic upbringing, but twisted somehow, the prayers she had learned as a girl, inverted or corrupted into something that felt wrong in her mouth even to hear. At the center of this formation stood Dr. Morwell, taller than the children surrounding him, dressed in dark robes that might have been ceremonial, or might simply have been a heavy coat, and in his hands he held one of his leather journals open to a page that he was reading from by the light of a lantern that hung from a shepherd's crook driven into the earth beside him. Margaret watched as Morwell called out a name, Daniel, and the singing stopped instantly, the silence that followed so complete that she could hear the candles guttering in the slight breeze. Morwell began to speak in that calm, measured voice about Daniel's life before the orphanage, about the boy's father who had beaten him, about the night Daniel had hidden in a barn and prayed that his father would die, about the guilt that Daniel carried for that prayer, even though the father had lived and continued his violence for 3 more years, until the drink finally took him. Morwell described these things with clinical precision, no judgment or emotion, just facts laid out like specimens on a table, and he called them Daniel's fragments of sin, the broken pieces of a damaged soul that needed to be extracted and transformed. When Morwell finished speaking, the children responded in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single sound that was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, just a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself saying, "We give it to the earth," and Daniel stepped forward from his place in the formation and knelt before one of the white flowers, placing his small hands on the frost-covered ground on either side of it. Margaret could not see his face from where she hid, but she saw his shoulders shake, saw what might have been tears or simply melting frost dripping from his chin, and she saw Dr. Morwell place his hand on the boy's head in what might have looked like a blessing but felt like a claiming. The ritual continued for the next hour, Morwell calling out name after name, reciting each child's private horrors and secret shames, things that no child should have to carry. and certainly should not have to hear spoken aloud in front of their peers. And after each recitation, the children chanted their response, and the named child would kneel before a flower and remain there trembling while Morwell moved to the next name. Margaret recognized most of the children from her brief time at the orphanage. She had washed their clothes and tucked them into bed, but there were a few she did not know, names that Morwell called out that produced no response, flowers that had no child kneeling before them, and she realized with mounting horror that these must be children who had come before, children who had completed whatever process Morwell was conducting and had moved on to some other phase or place. When the last name had been called and the last child had knelt, Morwell closed his journal and raised his hands toward the sky, and he spoke in Latin phrases that Margaret did not understand but which made the air feel heavy and thick, as if the words themselves had weight and substance. The children resumed their singing, that same hypnotic melody, and they began to sway in unison, their candles moving in synchronized patterns that created spirals of light mirroring the spirals of flowers at their feet. Margaret pulled back from the gate and pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, and she made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of her time at the orphanage, which was that she would not speak of what she had seen, would not ask questions or raise alarms, because she understood with perfect clarity that Dr. Morwell was something far more dangerous than a cruel headmaster or an abusive caretaker. He was something that operated on a level that her mind could barely grasp, and to confront him would be to invite her own destruction. She crept back to her room and lay in her bed shaking until dawn. And when the breakfast bell rang, she went down to the kitchen and performed her duties with shaking hands, and she watched the children file in for their morning meal, counting them silently, looking for the faces she had seen in the garden. Most of them were there, sitting in their usual places with their usual perfect posture and their usual empty smiles, but one was missing. Daniel's chair was empty, and when Margaret asked the cook where the boy was, trying to keep her voice casual and unconcerned, the cook said that Dr. Morwell had announced at the staff meeting that Daniel had been adopted by a wealthy family in Boston, who had specifically requested a boy of his age and temperament, that the adoption had been finalized quickly due to the family's connections, and that Daniel had left before dawn to catch the early train. Margaret nodded and said how wonderful that was, how lucky Daniel was to find a good home, and she went about her work while her mind screamed that there had been no family, no adoption, that Daniel had been in the garden at 2 a.m, kneeling before a white flower while Dr. Morwell spoke his secrets to the night, and that whatever had happened to him after the ritual had ended was something far worse than being sent to Boston. She thought about leaving, about packing her few belongings and walking out the gate and never looking back. But where would she go with no money and no prospects, and who would believe her if she told them what she had seen? A widow with no education claiming that a respected doctor was conducting dark rituals with orphaned children in a locked garden. So Margaret stayed, and she learned to sleep through the singing when it came on those nights when the moon was right and the garden called to the children, and she learned not to ask about the ones who disappeared, the ones whose flowers remained but whose places at the breakfast table stood empty. And she learned that survival sometimes meant becoming complicit in horrors that you lacked the power to stop. Margaret waited 3 weeks after the night. She witnessed the ritual before she found the courage to enter Dr. Morwell's study uninvited. 3 weeks during which she watched 2 more children vanish from the breakfast table with the same explanation of adoptions by Boston families. 3 weeks during which the singing in the garden continued on nights when the moon was full or nearly so. 3 weeks during which she barely slept and ate even less, her body growing gaunt and her eyes developing dark circles that made the cook ask if she was feeling ill. Margaret told the cook that she was fine, just adjusting to the work, but the truth was that she was being consumed by the need to understand what was happening in the walled garden, to find some explanation that would make sense of the rituals and the disappearances and the flowers that seemed to multiply even though no one ever planted new ones. She knew that Dr. Morwell left the estate every Thursday afternoon to attend meetings with his benefactors in Boston, taking the 2 o'clock train and not returning until the following morning, and she had been planning her entry into his private study with the same careful attention that a thief might plan a robbery, waiting for the right Thursday, the right alignment of circumstances when the other staff would be occupied, and the children would be at their lessons, and she would have at least 2 hours to search without interruption. The study was on the first floor at the end of a long hallway that smelled of beeswax and old wood, and Margaret approached the door with her heart pounding so hard that she could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her hands shaking as she tried the handle, and found it unlocked because Dr. Morwell's confidence was such that he did not believe anyone would dare enter his private space without permission. The room beyond was larger than Margaret had expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the grey April light, and every wall was lined with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, filled with medical texts and botanical references and volumes in languages Margaret did not recognize. There was a large desk made of dark wood positioned near the window, its surface covered with papers and journals and specimen jars containing things that Margaret did not want to examine too closely, and behind the desk was a glass-fronted cabinet containing what appeared to be medical instruments, scalpels and forceps and syringes arranged with obsessive precision. Margaret closed the door behind her and moved to the desk, her breath coming in short gasps, and she began to search through the papers with trembling fingers, looking for something that would explain the inexplicable, some key that would unlock the mystery of the garden and the children and the singing that haunted her sleep. She found the journals in the bottom drawer of the desk, more than 24 of them bound in dark leather and numbered in gold leaf on their spines, a chronicle of Dr. Morwell's work that stretched back more than 5 years to before he had even arrived in Grey Hollow. Margaret pulled out the first journal and opened it to a random page, and what she read there in Morwell's precise handwriting made her stomach turn and her vision blur with tears, because it was written in the language of science and medicine but described acts of cruelty that no sane person could justify, no matter how they dressed them up in academic terminology. The journal entry was dated September 1898 and detailed Morwell's developing theory of what he called inherited suffering, the idea that children were not born innocent but rather arrived in the world carrying the accumulated traumas and sins of their parents and grandparents, that they were vessels filled with poisonous memories and violent impulses that they themselves did not understand, but which would eventually corrupt them unless those toxins were extracted and neutralized. Morwell wrote that traditional psychology was too gentle, too concerned with the child's immediate comfort, and not focused enough on the long-term purification that was necessary to create truly functional members of society, and he proposed a series of experimental treatments that would forcibly separate children from their inherited suffering by making them confront and expel those dark fragments through ritual and physical intervention. Margaret turned page after page, reading with mounting horror as Morwell described his methods in clinical detail, each one more disturbing than the last, each one justified with twisted logic and false compassion. He wrote about sensory deprivation as a tool for breaking down the child's resistance to treatment, about placing them in wooden boxes barely large enough to contain their small bodies, and burying these boxes in the garden soil with only a hollow reed to provide air, leaving them in the darkness and silence for hours or days until their minds became malleable and receptive to suggestion. He described forced confessions conducted while the children were submerged in ice water, their bodies going numb and their thoughts slowing until they would admit to anything, confess to sins they had never committed and fears they had never articulated, and Morwell would transcribe these confessions onto small pieces of parchment that he called binding scripts. The journals detailed the use of silver needles inserted beneath fingernails to mark the pain's location, a technique Morwell claimed allowed him to create physical anchors for emotional trauma so that it could be more effectively transferred out of the child's body and into the earth, and Margaret read descriptions of children screaming and begging and eventually falling silent as the needles did their work, their small hands becoming maps of suffering marked with tiny puncture wounds that Morwell photographed and catalogued with scientific precision. But it was in the later journals, the ones from after Morwell had established the orphanage in Grey Hollow, that Margaret found the full scope of his madness laid bare. He had moved beyond simple treatment and into something that could only be described as transformation, a process by which he believed he could permanently extract a child's suffering and plant it in the garden where it would be absorbed by the earth and converted into something pure and beautiful. Each child was a subject in his grand experiment, each one carefully selected for the particular quality of their trauma, and Morwell wrote about them with the detached interest of a botanist describing different varieties of roses, noting which children produced the most vibrant flowers and which methods of extraction yielded the best results. He had developed an entire taxonomy of suffering, categories and subcategories that organized children by the type of abuse they had endured, the depth of their psychological damage, the richness of their emotional soil, and he matched each child to a specific location in the garden, based on formulas that involved lunar cycles and seasonal alignments and calculations that made no sense to Margaret, but which Morwell treated as absolute scientific truth. The journals revealed that each white flower in the garden represented what Morwell called a cleansed soul, a child who had completed the final stage of treatment and had given themselves fully to the earth, their physical bodies buried in the soil to decompose and feed the roots, while their purified essence supposedly ascended to some higher plane. Margaret read entry after entry describing this process, the clinical notes that detailed how long each child survived in their final burial, how their struggles gradually weakened and then ceased, how the flowers that grew from their graves were more luminous and more fragrant than any natural bloom. Morwell wrote about checking on the buried children through the night, listening through hollow reeds to their breathing and their muffled cries, recording the exact moment when silence fell and the transformation was complete, and he described this moment not as death but as graduation, as the successful conclusion of treatment that freed the child from the burden of their inherited suffering and freed the world from the damaged adult that child would have become. Margaret found sketches in the margins of the journals, anatomical drawings showing the placement of bodies in the garden soil, diagrams of root systems extending from decomposing flesh to flower stems, calculations of nitrogen and phosphorus ratios that could only come from human remains. She found photographs pasted onto pages, children's faces before and after treatment, the before images showing frightened eyes and tense mouths, while the after images showed the same children with empty smiles and glassy stares. And below each after image was a date, and the words transferred to garden, followed by a number corresponding to a location in the spiral patterns. Margaret realized, with a horror so profound it felt like drowning, that she had been walking past these graves every day, that the beautiful white flowers she had admired when she first arrived were feeding on the bodies of children, that the garden was not a sanctuary but a cemetery disguised as something pure, and that every child currently living in the orphanage was simply waiting their turn to be planted. The final journal, the one that was still being actively written in, contained Morwell's most recent observations and plans for the future. He wrote about expanding the garden, about securing additional funding to increase the number of children he could process, about his belief that if he could scale his methods to a large enough operation, he could actually cleanse an entire generation of its inherited trauma and create a new breed of human beings free from the psychological damage that had plagued mankind since the beginning of civilization. He wrote about the garden as if it were a living thing, an entity that had grown hungry and intelligent through its diet of suffering, and he described conversations he claimed to have with it during his midnight visits, the flowers supposedly speaking to him in voices that guided his research and told him which children were ready for the final treatment. Margaret read these passages with shaking hands, unable to decide if Morwell was deliberately using supernatural language as a metaphor or if he had genuinely convinced himself that the garden possessed some form of consciousness, but either way the result was the same. Children were dying in the earth, and Morwell believed he was saving them. Margaret closed the journal and returned it to the drawer exactly as she had found it, her movements automatic because her mind was too overwhelmed to fully process what she had learned, and she walked out of the study and up to her room where she sat on the edge of her bed and tried to decide what to do with this knowledge. She could go to the police, but what would she tell them? That a respected doctor was burying children in his garden based on pseudoscientific theories about inherited trauma, and what proof did she have beyond journals that she had read without permission and rituals she had witnessed while hiding in the dark? She could try to rescue the children, to smuggle them out one by one, but there were more than 30 of them now, and where would they go, and who would take them in when the authorities would simply return them to Dr. Morwell's care? She could confront Morwell directly, but she had seen what happened to children who opposed him, had seen the needle through Thomas's tongue and the empty chairs at breakfast, and she knew that her life meant nothing to a man who could kill children and call it therapy. So Margaret made the choice that cowards and survivors have always made when faced with evil that exceeded their power to stop, which was to remain silent and wait for an opportunity that might never come, to bear witness to horrors while telling herself that someday, somehow, she would find a way to make someone listen, even as each day that passed made her more complicit and more trapped in the web of Morwell's carefully constructed nightmare. Margaret lasted 6 weeks after reading the journals before the weight of what she knew became unbearable, and she decided that she would rather die trying to save even 2 children than live with the knowledge that she had done nothing while dozens more were fed to the garden's hunger. She chose a night in late May when Dr. Morwell had retired early with what he claimed was a headache, and she went to the dormitory where the youngest children slept and woke 2 girls, Emma and Sarah, both barely 7 years old, pressing her hand over their mouths before they could cry out and whispering urgently that they needed to be very quiet, that she was taking them somewhere safe, that they must not make a sound or ask any questions. The girls looked at her with those empty eyes that all of Morwell's children developed, eyes that showed no hope because hope had been systematically extracted from them, but they followed her instructions with the same mechanical obedience they showed to everything, climbing out of their beds and putting on their shoes while Margaret stuffed blankets under their covers to buy them a few extra hours before anyone noticed they were missing. She led them down the back stairs and through the kitchen, each step carefully planned, each movement rehearsed in her mind 100 times, and her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst as she opened the back door and felt the cool night air on her face. Freedom just 50 yards away across the lawn to the front gate that she had unlocked earlier while pretending to sweep the front steps. They made it halfway across the lawn, Margaret holding each girl by the hand and moving as quickly as she dared without running, before she saw the figure standing at the gate, a dark silhouette against the lighter darkness of the street beyond, and she knew with absolute certainty who it was, even before he stepped into the moonlight and she could see his face. Dr. Morwell stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression not angry or surprised, but rather curious, almost amused, as if he had been expecting this exact scenario and was interested to see how it would unfold. Margaret stopped walking, her grip on the children's hands tightening involuntarily, and she felt Emma and Sarah go rigid beside her, their bodies responding to Morwell's presence with the same trained fear that animals showed to predators. For a long moment no one moved, the 3 fugitives frozen in the middle of the lawn, while Morwell watched them with those pale eyes that reflected the moon like chips of ice, and then he spoke in that soft, measured voice that was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been, asking Margaret where she thought she was going at such a late hour and whether she had considered the consequences of her actions. Margaret tried to speak, tried to summon the courage to tell him that she was taking these children away from his madness, that she would go to the police and the newspapers and anyone who would listen, that his experiments would end tonight, but the words dried up in her throat because she saw in his face that he already knew everything she was thinking and had already dismissed it as the futile resistance of someone who did not understand the scope of his work. Morwell walked toward them slowly, not hurrying, each step deliberate and controlled, and he told Margaret to release the children and send them back to bed, that they needed their rest for tomorrow's lessons. Margaret shook her head and pulled the girls closer to her, and Emma began to cry. Not the normal crying of a frightened child, but something more disturbing, a high-pitched keening that suggested her mind was breaking from the conflict between her terror of Morwell and her desperate need to be saved. Morwell stopped a few feet away and looked down at Emma with what might have been pity or might have been clinical interest, and he told the girl gently that she was experiencing unnecessary distress, that Mrs. Walsh did not understand what was best for her, and that she should go back inside and take Sarah with her. The 2 girls released Margaret's hands immediately, their obedience to Morwell so deeply programmed that even their will to escape could not overcome it, and they walked past him toward the house with their heads down, leaving Margaret standing alone in the darkness with the man whose journals had revealed him to be something far worse than human. Morwell regarded Margaret for a long moment, his head tilted slightly to one side, in that way he had of studying people as if they were specimens under glass, and then he did something that she had not expected, which was to invite her to sit with him on the stone bench near the garden wall and talk about what she had discovered. His tone was not threatening or accusatory, but rather conversational, as if he were proposing a discussion between colleagues rather than a confrontation between a murderer and a witness to his crimes, and Margaret found herself following him to the bench and sitting down because she could not think of what else to do, her plan having ended the moment he appeared at the gate. Morwell sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he began to speak about his childhood in a voice that was soft and almost dreamy, describing a boy who had been beaten by his father for the smallest infractions, locked in closets for hours or days, burned with cigarettes when he cried, subjected to cruelties that had no name and no purpose, except the expression of one human being's capacity for evil. He told Margaret that he had spent his entire youth in a state of constant terror, that his father's violence had poisoned every moment of his existence, and that when he finally escaped at age 15 by running away to Boston, he had carried that poison with him like a disease that infected everything he touched. Morwell explained that he had spent years studying medicine and psychology, trying to understand what his father had done to him, trying to map the damage and find some way to undo it, and he had eventually arrived at a terrible realization, which was that suffering could not be undone, it could only be transformed. He described his theory to Margaret as if he were lecturing to a classroom of students, his voice taking on that academic tone that made atrocities sound like theorems, explaining that trauma lived in the body like a physical substance, that it accumulated in the tissues and bones, and could be extracted through careful application of pressure and pain and ritual. He had developed his methods through trial and error, he said, first on himself and later on others who were willing to submit to his treatments, and he had discovered that children were the most responsive subjects because their minds were still forming and could be reshaped more completely than adults whose personalities had already calcified. The garden, he explained, was the culmination of his research, a place where suffering could be literally planted in the earth and converted through biological processes into something beautiful and pure, the white flowers acting as visible proof that his theories were correct and that death was not an ending but a transformation. Morwell stood and walked to the garden wall, beckoning for Margaret to follow, and when she did, he unlocked the gate and led her inside to where the white flowers glowed in the moonlight like earthbound stars. He stopped beside one particular flower, larger and more luminous than the others, and he knelt down and touched its petals with something approaching tenderness, and he told Margaret that this was a boy named Samuel who had arrived at the orphanage 2 years earlier, a child so damaged by his past that he screamed in his sleep every night, terrible screams that suggested he was being murdered over and over in his dreams. Morwell said that he had worked with Samuel for months, extracting the trauma piece by piece through the methods described in his journals, and when the boy was finally ready, Morwell had given him the gift of final purification, had laid him in a prepared grave and covered him with earth, and allowed him to feed the flower that now grew in his place. This was a boy named Samuel, Morwell repeated. He used to scream in his sleep. Now he feeds beauty, and the doctor looked at Margaret with those cold eyes and asked if she could understand what he was trying to accomplish, whether she could see that this was not murder but mercy, not cruelty but the ultimate compassion. Margaret tried to back away, tried to run, but Morwell was faster than she expected for a man of his age, and his hand clamped around her wrist with surprising strength, while his other hand produced a small cloth from his pocket, a cloth that smelled of something chemical and sweet, and he pressed it over her nose and mouth while she struggled and tried to scream. The world began to spin and darken, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that closed in from all sides, and the last thing she heard before unconsciousness took her was Morwell's voice saying that she needed to experience the treatment firsthand in order to truly understand it, that he could not have her interference disrupting the work, and that this was for her own benefit as much as his. When Margaret woke, she could not see anything because she was in absolute darkness, and she could not move because she was confined in a space barely larger than her body, her knees pulled up to her chest and her head bent forward in a position that sent shooting pains down her neck and spine. She tried to scream, but her voice came out muffled and wrong, and then she realized that she was breathing through something, a hollow reed that extended upward, through what she understood with dawning horror was soil, earth packed tight around the wooden box in which she had been buried alive. The panic that seized Margaret in that moment was beyond anything she had ever experienced, a terror so complete that it erased thought and left only animal desperation, and she clawed at the wooden walls of her prison until her fingernails broke and bled. She pushed against the lid until her shoulders ached and her muscles cramped. She screamed until her throat was raw, but nothing changed. The darkness remained absolute, and the space remained impossibly small, and the air that came through the reed tasted of dirt and decay. Time lost all meaning in that buried box, seconds stretching into hours or compressing into moments, and Margaret's mind began to fracture under the strain. Hallucinations blooming in the darkness, voices that she knew were not real, but which sounded so clear and close that she turned her head trying to find their source. She heard children singing, the same Latin phrases from the ritual, and she realized that it was not a hallucination but actual sound filtering down through the soil, the orphans standing above her grave performing their night hymns while she suffocated below them. Water came periodically, drops that fell through a second hollow reed onto her lips, barely enough to keep her alive, and she licked at this moisture with a desperate gratitude that shamed her even in her delirium. 3 days Margaret spent in that box, though she had no way to measure the time except by the rhythms of the singing above and the alternation of what she assumed was day and night based on subtle changes in the temperature of the air that came through the breathing reed. By the second day she had stopped screaming and clawing, her body too weak and her mind too shattered to maintain the effort, and she simply lay in the darkness, crying silently and praying for death or rescue with equal fervor. By the third day she had stopped crying and stopped praying and stopped thinking in any coherent way. Her consciousness reduced to a dim awareness of discomfort and a growing detachment from her own body, as if she were floating somewhere above the box watching this happen to someone else. When the lid finally opened and hands reached down to pull her out, she did not resist or respond. Her muscles had stopped obeying her commands, and her eyes could not adjust to the sudden light, even though it was barely dawn. "Doctor?" Morwell lifted her from the box as if she weighed nothing, her body wasted and pale and covered in her own filth, and he carried her to the bench where they had sat before, and laid her down gently, and he stroked her matted hair, and asked in a voice that was almost tender whether she was calm now, whether she understood that resistance was futile, and that acceptance was the only path to peace. Margaret nodded, not because she understood or accepted, but because the person she had been before the burial no longer existed, that self had died in the darkness, and what remained was something hollowed out and compliant, a shell that would do whatever was necessary to avoid being put back in that box. Morwell smiled at her response and told her that she had done very well, that she had proven herself capable of transformation, and that now she could truly begin to help with his work, because she had experienced the treatment firsthand and could appreciate its therapeutic value. He helped her to her feet and led her back to the house where he bathed her himself with clinical efficiency and gave her clean clothes and put her to bed in her small room, and Margaret lay there staring at the ceiling while her mind tried to assemble the broken pieces of itself into something that could function. She never tried to leave again, never spoke of what had happened to her, never looked directly at the garden or the children who would eventually be planted there, and she performed her duties with the same mechanical precision that the orphans showed in everything they did, a living ghost moving through the house of horrors that had become her entire world. By the winter of 1918, the Innocence Garden Home had processed more than 60 children through Dr. Rhymes, Morwell's program of transformation, each one arriving broken and frightened from various institutions and agencies across New England, each one subjected to the methods detailed in those leather journals, and each one eventually graduating to the garden where they fed the earth and the flowers that grew in perfect spirals behind the stone wall. The official records showed adoptions, careful paperwork signed by wealthy families from Boston and New York and Philadelphia, families whose names appeared in social registers and whose addresses corresponded to real estates, but when anyone tried to trace these children after their supposed departures, they found that the trail went cold immediately, that no record existed of these boys and girls attending schools or seeing doctors or appearing in census data, as if they had simply vanished from the world the moment they left Grey Hollow. The authorities never questioned this because Dr. Morwell's reputation was impeccable and his connections were powerful, and the few people who might have raised concerns, people like Father Byrne or Miss Hewitt or the groundskeeper Morrison, had either convinced themselves that nothing untoward was happening or had learned that speaking against Morwell was dangerous to their own well-being and future prospects. The town had prospered during the orphanage's operation, money flowing from Morwell's benefactors into local businesses and civic improvements, and prosperity had a way of making people blind to inconvenient truths. But that winter brought changes that no amount of willful ignorance could prevent, starting with Dr. Morwell's health, which began to decline rapidly in November, when he contracted what he initially dismissed as a common cold, but which developed into a fever that would not break no matter what treatments he applied. Morwell had always been a man of rigorous self-control, someone who seemed to exist above the vulnerabilities of ordinary flesh, but the fever stripped that control away layer by layer, leaving him weak and confused, and increasingly dependent on Margaret to manage the daily operations of the orphanage. She cared for him with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to all her tasks, bringing him water and broth and changing his sweat-soaked sheets, but she felt no compassion for the man who had buried her alive and murdered dozens of children. She simply performed her duties because she no longer knew how to do anything else, her will having been so thoroughly broken that even the sight of her tormentor dying in agony produced no emotional response. The children continued their routines without Morwell's direct supervision, so deeply programmed that they needed no guidance to maintain their schedules and their studies and their night hymns in the garden, and Margaret watched them move through the house like small automatons and wondered if any part of their original selves still existed beneath the conditioning, or if Morwell had succeeded in erasing everything that had made them human. As December arrived and the fever worsened, Morwell began to speak in his delirium, long rambling monologues that Margaret heard when she sat beside his bed in the evenings, and what he said in those fevered hours revealed depths of his madness that even his journals had not fully captured. He spoke about the garden as if it were a living entity, a consciousness that had grown from the accumulated suffering of all the children he had planted there, and he claimed that he could hear it speaking to him through the walls, telling him that his work was not finished, that there were still impurities in the world that needed to be extracted and transformed. He described visions of flowers that grew tall as trees, their roots extending through the earth to connect with underground rivers that would carry their purifying influence across the entire country, and he spoke of future generations of children who would be born already cleansed because the soil itself had been sanctified by his methods. Margaret listened to these ravings with a blank expression, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and when Morwell's lucid moments returned, and he tried to give her instructions about continuing his research after his death, she simply nodded and said nothing, knowing that the easiest way to avoid conflict was to appear compliant while having no intention of following through. By early January, the fever had consumed so much of Morwell's strength that he could no longer leave his bed, his body wasting away until his skin stretched tight over his bones and his eyes sank deep into their sockets, and he began to ask Margaret to bring him his journals so he could review his notes and add final observations to his research. She brought them to him one at a time, watching as his skeletal hands turned the pages with trembling fingers, his lips moving as he read passages about children whose names he had not spoken in years, and sometimes he would pause and look at Margaret with an expression that might have been regret or might have been satisfaction. It was impossible to tell which. On a grey morning in late January, Morwell called Margaret to his bedside and told her in a voice barely above a whisper that he was going to die soon, that he could feel the fever winning its war against his body, and that she must promise him that she would finish the work, that she would continue to operate the orphanage and process new children through the garden until his methods had been perfected and documented and could be shared with the wider medical community. Margaret looked down at this dying man who had destroyed her life and the lives of so many children, and she said simply and clearly, no, she would not finish his work, she would not continue his experiments, and when he was dead, she would lock the garden and burn his journals, and do everything in her power to erase what he had done. Morwell stared at her with shock and then rage and then something that looked almost like fear, and he tried to rise from the bed, but his strength was gone and he fell back against the pillows, gasping for breath. He told Margaret that she did not understand, that the garden needed to be fed or it would die, that the children already there would have suffered for nothing if the work stopped before completion, but Margaret simply shook her head and walked toward the door. As she reached it, Morwell began to speak again, but this time he was not speaking to her, he was whispering names, the names of every child he had killed, reciting them in chronological order like a prayer or a rosary, and Margaret paused in the doorway to listen as he went through the list. Samuel, Thomas, Daniel, Emma, Catherine, Rebecca, dozens of names that represented lives cut short and suffering, that had been weaponized in service of a theory that was nothing more than madness dressed in academic language. Morwell continued whispering, even as his voice grew weaker and his breathing became labored. and the last word he spoke before death finally took him was a name that Margaret did not recognize, perhaps a child he had planned to process next, or perhaps someone from his own past, and then his eyes closed and his chest stopped rising, and the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Margaret stood looking at his corpse for a long moment, feeling nothing, and then she went downstairs and informed the remaining staff that Dr. Morwell had passed away and that the orphanage would be closing immediately, that arrangements would be made to transfer the current children to other institutions, and that everyone should begin preparing for the estate to be shut down. The news spread through Greyhollow within hours, and the reaction was one of carefully performed sadness mixed with an undercurrent of relief that no one wanted to acknowledge, because while the town had benefited from Morwell's presence, everyone had also felt the wrongness that emanated from the walled garden and the two quiet children who never laughed or played. The benefactors arrived within days to settle Morwell's affairs, and they arranged for the remaining children to be distributed among various orphanages in other cities, and they agreed that the estate should be sold, and the proceeds used to establish a scholarship fund in Morwell's name, a final act of reputation management that would allow them to remember their investment as charitable rather than complicit. The garden was locked, and the key was given to Margaret as a formality, though everyone understood that the space was to remain sealed permanently, and within a month the Innocence Garden Home for Forgotten Children ceased to exist as anything more than a memory that the town worked very hard to forget. But Margaret did not leave when the orphanage closed. Despite having no official role and no salary, and no reason to remain in a place that held only horror for her, she simply stayed in the caretaker's room on the third floor of the empty building, living off the small savings she had accumulated and the occasional charity of townspeople who felt vaguely guilty about abandoning her there, and she became a recluse who was rarely seen outside the estate's grounds. She never spoke about what had happened during Morwell's years of operation, never tried to tell authorities about the graves in the garden or the journals that she had indeed burned in the kitchen stove one night while crying silently, never attempted to warn anyone about the dangers of unchecked power and institutional isolation. She had been too thoroughly broken by her own experience in the buried box, her capacity for action shattered so completely that even with Morwell dead she could not summon the will to expose his crimes, and instead she simply existed in a state of numb waiting, though she could not have said what she was waiting for if anyone had asked. The years passed, and Margaret grew older and greyer, her hair turning white and her body becoming frail, and the town's memory of the orphanage faded as new generations grew up who had never known Dr. Morwell or the children who had lived behind the stone wall. But every spring, when the weather warmed and the earth thawed, the white flowers in the locked garden bloomed in their perfect spirals, visible from the upper windows of the estate where Margaret spent most of her time, and she noticed that there were more of them each year, far more than the 63 children who had been buried there, as if the garden were somehow propagating itself and spreading its roots deeper into the soil. She watched these flowers through the glass and wondered if Morwell had been right about something, if the garden had indeed taken on a life of its own, and she thought about the children who fed those roots, and whether any part of them still existed in the earth, or if they had been completely consumed by the transformation that Morwell had promised them. And on quiet nights, when the wind was right, Margaret sometimes thought she could hear singing coming from the garden, those same Latin phrases that had haunted her nightmares, and she would close her windows and pull her blankets over her head and wait for morning to come, a prisoner in the house that had once been her prison, watching over graves that would never be acknowledged and keeping secrets that would die with her when her own time finally came. The old Ashworth estate had stood empty for more than a decade when a development company out of Hertford purchased the property in the spring of 1981 with plans to demolish the decaying Victorian mansion and build a complex of luxury condominiums that would capitalize on Greyhollow's recent transformation from a dying mill town into a bedroom community for Boston commuters who wanted historic New England charm at affordable prices. Margaret Walsh had died in 1971 at the age of 83, found in her third-floor room by a postal worker who had noticed mail piling up, and with her death, the last living person who knew the truth about Dr. Morwell's work had taken that knowledge to the grave, leaving behind only town records that showed the Innocence Garden Home had operated from 1902 to 1918 and had successfully placed dozens of orphaned children with adoptive families. The developers hired a local contracting firm to handle the demolition and site preparation, and on a bright Tuesday morning in June, a crew of 6 men arrived with a backhoe and excavator to begin clearing the overgrown grounds behind the main building, starting with the area enclosed by the old stone wall that had been locked and untouched for more than 60 years. The foreman, a man named Robert Chen, who had lived in Grey Hollow his entire life and whose grandfather had once worked as a groundskeeper on the estate, felt uneasy about disturbing the walled garden for reasons he could not quite articulate. Something about the way the white flowers still bloomed there every spring despite no one tending them. Something about the perfect spiral patterns they formed that seemed too deliberate to be natural. But business was business, and he had a schedule to keep, so he directed the excavator operator to punch through the iron gate and begin clearing the vegetation, and within minutes the machine's bucket was tearing through soil that had not been disturbed since before most of the crew had been born. The work proceeded normally for the first hour, the excavator removing topsoil and dumping it into trucks to be hauled away, the crew members using shovels and rakes to clear smaller debris, and then the excavator's bucket struck something wooden about 3 feet below the surface, and the operator stopped the machine and climbed down to investigate what he assumed was an old fence post or tree stump. What he found instead was a wooden box, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, constructed from planks that had rotted in places, but remained largely intact due to the way they had been sealed with pitch or tar, and when he called the foreman over to look at it, they both stood staring down into the trench with growing concern because the dimensions of the box suggested a purpose that neither wanted to acknowledge. Robert Chen told the operator to carefully excavate around the box without damaging it further, and as the soil was cleared away, they saw that the box had a hinged lid secured with iron nails that had rusted but still held, and lying beside it in the earth were several more boxes of similar size and construction, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The foreman made a decision in that moment that would change the trajectory of his life and the history of Grey Hollow, which was to stop all excavation work immediately and call the police rather than open the boxes himself, some instinct telling him that whatever was inside them needed to be handled by people with more authority and experience with the darker aspects of human nature. The Grey Hollow Police Department sent 2 officers who arrived expecting to find nothing more than an old pet cemetery or perhaps some antique farm equipment, but when they saw the boxes and the way they were stacked in layers beneath the garden, they called for their chief, and the chief took one look and called the state police, and within hours the site was crawling with investigators and forensic specialists, and the media had gotten wind that something significant had been discovered at the old orphanage estate. The excavation continued under careful supervision, archaeologists and forensic anthropologists working alongside police detectives to document and remove each box, and as the day wore on and the count of boxes continued to climb, a horrible picture began to emerge of what the garden had really been. By the time the sun set on that first day, they had uncovered 23 boxes, and by the end of the week the total had reached 63, each one positioned within the spiral patterns that the white flowers had traced on the surface, each one containing remains that would take months to fully analyze and identify, but which were clearly human and clearly those of children. The boxes were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Boston, where they were opened in a sterile laboratory environment under conditions that allowed for maximum preservation of evidence, and what the forensic teams found inside those coffins would become the subject of criminal investigations and academic studies and trauma counseling sessions for everyone involved in the examination. Each box contained a small skeleton curled in a fetal position, the bones showing signs of malnutrition and disease, but also something more disturbing, which was evidence of death by asphyxiation or dehydration while confined in the box itself. The scratches on the inside of the wooden lids were unmistakable, tiny finger marks that had worn grooves in the soft pine, some deep enough to have splintered the wood, and several of the skeletons showed fractures to the hands and arms consistent with prolonged attempts to break free from confinement. The medical examiners could determine from the bone development that the children had ranged in age from approximately 5 to 13 years old, and dental records combined with what little documentation existed from the orphanage allowed them to identify 17 of the victims by name, though the rest would remain unknown, children who had been so thoroughly erased from official records that even death could not give them back their identities. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was found in every single skeleton, A silver needle pierced through the jawbone in a way that suggested it had been inserted while the child was still alive, the bone showing signs of healing around the puncture site in some cases, which meant the needle had been worn for days or weeks before the final burial. Wrapped around each needle was a small piece of parchment that had somehow survived the decades of decomposition, protected by the silver and by the particular chemical composition of the soil, and when these parchments were carefully unrolled and examined under magnification, they revealed phrases written in neat handwriting, affirmations or confessions that varied slightly from child to child, but which all shared a common theme of submission and purification. I will not fear the dark. Read one. I am clean now. Read another. My suffering feeds beauty. The pain is temporary, but the garden is eternal. I give myself to the earth willingly. Dozens of variations on the same twisted logic that suggested the children had been forced to internalize their own deaths as acts of spiritual transformation rather than murder. The forensic analysis of the soil itself revealed anomalies that turned the investigation from a historical curiosity into something that felt almost supernatural in its horror, because the earth in the garden showed chemical signatures that were inconsistent with normal decomposition and suggested that Dr. Morwell had understood more about the relationship between human remains and plant growth than any legitimate scientist of his era should have known. The soil was extraordinarily enriched with calcium and phosphorus, trace elements that came from bone dissolution, but in concentrations that suggested the bodies had not simply decomposed naturally, but had been actively processed in some way, perhaps through the addition of chemicals or through manipulation of moisture and temperature that accelerated breakdown. Botanists brought in to examine the white flowers that still grew in the garden identified them as a variety that did not appear in any standard horticultural reference, possibly a hybrid that Morwell had created through selective breeding, and when they analyzed the flowers' root systems, they found that the roots extended much deeper than normal, some reaching down 6 feet or more to where the boxes had been buried, and the cellular structure of the roots showed unusual development that suggested they had indeed been feeding on the human remains in a symbiotic relationship that blurred the line between natural process and deliberate design. The investigation expanded to include Morwell's journals, which Margaret had claimed to have burned but which were discovered in 1,981 inches a trunk in the attic of the estate, protected by oilcloth and carefully preserved, as if she had not been able to bring herself to destroy them despite her stated intentions, and these journals provided the final pieces of the puzzle that explained exactly what had happened in the garden between 1902 and 1918. The district attorney who reviewed the evidence stated publicly that if Dr. Elias Morwell had still been alive, he would have faced 63 counts of first-degree murder along with charges of child abuse and unlawful human experimentation, and that the case represented one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of institutional killing in American history, comparable to the worst atrocities committed in the name of science or medicine. But Morwell had been dead for more than 60 years, and Margaret Walsh, who might have been charged as an accessory, was also beyond the reach of justice, and the town of Grey Hollow was left to grapple with the revelation that for 16 years children had been tortured and murdered in their midst, while the community had not only failed to intervene, but had actively supported and funded the Fortid of Especially work through ignorance and willful blindness. The condominium development was immediately cancelled, the property designated as a crime scene and later as a memorial site, and the remains of the 63 children were eventually buried together in a section of the town cemetery under a monument that bore their names where they were known and simply stated, "Unknown child," for those who could not be identified. The white flowers were destroyed, the garden soil excavated and removed to a hazardous waste facility, and the stone wall was torn down. But even decades later, there are people in Grey Hollow who claim that on certain spring nights you can still smell the sweet fragrance of those flowers in the air, still hear the faint sound of children singing in Latin, and that the ground where the garden once stood remains barren no matter what attempts are made to landscape it, as if the earth itself remembers what was done there and refuses to support new life. In the years following the excavation, Dr. Elias Morwell's journals became the subject of intense academic scrutiny, housed in a climate-controlled archive at a major university where psychologists, historians, criminologists, and ethicists sought to understand how a trained physician and self-proclaimed reformer had transformed into one of history's most methodical child killers. The journals, which numbered 27 volumes spanning from 1898 to 1918, provided an unprecedented window into the mind of a man who had weaponized the emerging field of psychoanalysis and combined it with botanical experimentation to create what he genuinely believed was a revolutionary treatment for inherited trauma, but what was in reality a systematic program of torture and murder dressed in the language of science and therapy. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a clinical psychologist who spent 3 years analyzing the journals as part of her doctoral research, described them as the most disturbing documents she had ever encountered, not because they contained graphic descriptions of violence, though they did, but because they revealed a complete absence of moral reasoning or emotional connection to the suffering Morwell inflicted, his entries reading like laboratory notes from an agricultural experiment rather than accounts of children dying in agony beneath the soil. The journals showed that Morwell had begun developing his theories while still in his 20s, shortly after escaping his own abusive childhood, and that his initial motivation had been genuinely therapeutic, a desperate attempt to understand and heal the psychological damage that his father's violence had caused. But somewhere in his studies of early psychoanalytic theory and his readings of obscure botanical texts about plant-soil relationships, Morwell had made a conceptual leap that transformed healing into horror, becoming convinced that human suffering was not an abstract psychological state, but a physical substance that could be extracted from the body through pain and transferred into the earth, where it would be neutralized and converted into growth. His writings from this period showed increasingly grandiose thinking, a belief that he alone had discovered the key to eliminating psychological trauma from the human species, and a growing contempt for traditional therapeutic approaches that he viewed as too gentle and too slow to accomplish the fundamental transformation he envisioned. Morwell wrote that children were ideal subjects for his methods because their minds were still forming and could be completely reshaped, and because society cared so little about orphaned and abandoned children that their disappearance would barely be noticed, a calculation that proved horrifyingly accurate given that his work continued uninterrupted for 16 years. What struck the researchers most profoundly was Morwell's complete lack of remorse or recognition that what he was doing constituted murder, his journals showing instead a clinical curiosity about the effects of his treatments and a meticulous attention to detail in documenting outcomes. He described children's deaths in exactly the same tone and format that a gardener might use to log seasonal crop yields, noting the date of burial, the duration of survival in the box, the quality of the screams or prayers that filtered up through the breathing reed, and later the health and appearance of the flowers that grew from each grave. A typical entry from 1905 read, Subject 17, female age 8, buried March 23 at 11 p.m., survived for approximately 38 hours before respiration ceased. Flower emergence noted April 12. Petals showed excellent color and unusual size, suggesting high-quality transformation of maternal trauma into botanical energy. There were hundreds of such entries, each one representing a child who had been systematically broken down through sensory deprivation and forced confession, and finally buried alive, and Morwell recorded every detail with the dispassionate precision of a scientist conducting peer-reviewed research, apparently never experiencing even a moment of doubt about whether his actions were justified. The case became a landmark in the study of what scholars termed institutional evil, the particular type of cruelty that emerges when intellectual frameworks and institutional isolation combine to insulate perpetrators from normal moral constraints. Dr. Raymond Foster, a historian of medicine who wrote extensively about Morwell, argued that the doctor's crimes were made possible by 3 factors that frequently appear in cases of systematic abuse. First, a legitimate professional credential that gave him authority and credibility. Second, a population of victims who had no social power or advocates to speak on their behalf. And third, a theoretical justification that allowed him to reframe his actions as beneficial rather than harmful. Foster noted that Morwell was not unique in using these elements to enable atrocity, that throughout history there had been doctors and researchers who committed horrors while believing themselves to be advancing human knowledge, but that what made Morwell particularly chilling was the extent to which he had created an entirely self-contained system of belief that required no external validation or peer review, a closed loop of theory and practice that justified itself through its own internal logic. The isolation of the walled garden had been both literal and metaphorical, a physical space where Morwell could conduct his experiments without observation, and a psychological space where his ideas could develop without being challenged by contact with ethical norms or competing perspectives. Scholars who studied the journals identified in Morwell's writings all the classic markers of psychopathy: the lack of empathy and remorse, the grandiose sense of self-importance, the manipulation of others, the shallow emotional affect, but they also found something more complex and disturbing, which was evidence that Morwell had constructed an elaborate philosophical framework that allowed him to view his lack of empathy not as a defect but as a strength, a clarity of vision that freed him from sentimental attachment to outdated moral concepts. He wrote in one entry that compassion was an evolutionary weakness that prevented humans from making the difficult choices necessary for species improvement, and that his ability to watch children suffer without emotional disturbance was proof that he had transcended ordinary human limitations and achieved a higher state of consciousness. This fusion of psychopathy with intellectual pretension created a monster who was capable of extraordinary cruelty while maintaining absolute certainty in his own righteousness, and the journals showed that even as his body failed and death approached, Morwell never wavered in his conviction that he had been engaged in important and necessary work. But perhaps the most chilling discovery in the entire archive was the final entry, written on the 27th of January 1918, the day before Morwell died, when the fever had reduced him to a skeletal shadow barely capable of holding a pen, but still driven to record his thoughts for posterity. In shaking handwriting that became progressively less legible as the entry continued, Morwell wrote that his death would not end the work he had begun, that the garden had taken on a life and purpose beyond his individual efforts, and that the transformations he had initiated in the soil and in the plants would continue indefinitely, spreading their influence in ways that he could not predict, but which he trusted would fulfill his vision. "The garden will grow long after I am gone," he wrote in that final passage, the words barely readable, but preserved in the archive under protective glass. "They will always bloom," and researchers have debated ever since whether this was simply the delusion of a dying man trying to convince himself that his life had meaning, or whether Morwell had genuinely believed that he had created something that transcended normal biological processes and would persist through some combination of careful preparation and supernatural influence. The fact that the white flowers had indeed continued to bloom for more than 60 years after his death, propagating themselves without human intervention and following the same spiral patterns he had designed, suggested to some that perhaps Morwell's final words had contained more truth than anyone wanted to acknowledge, that his evil had not died with him but had been planted in the earth where it would continue to grow and spread, feeding on the suffering he had sown, and waiting patiently for conditions that might allow it to bloom again. The memorial was dedicated on a cold October day in 1985, 4 years after the excavation had revealed the full scope of Dr. Morwell's crimes, and it consisted of 63 white stones arranged in a spiral pattern that deliberately echoed the layout of the original garden, each stone engraved with a child's name where known and bearing the simple inscription, "Unknown Child," for those whose identities had been lost to time, and Morwell's meticulous erasure of records. The ceremony drew hundreds of people from across New England, including survivors of other abusive institutions who came to bear witness and to lay flowers at the stones, their presence a reminder that Morwell's crimes, while extreme, were not entirely unique, that throughout history children in the care of institutions had been vulnerable to those who saw them as objects rather than human beings deserving of protection and dignity. The governor of Massachusetts spoke about the importance of remembering this tragedy so that it could never happen again, and he announced the passage of what would become known as the Morwell Act, legislation that required unannounced inspections of all orphanages, mental health facilities, and residential treatment centers for children, along with mandatory reporting protocols and independent oversight boards, designed to prevent the kind of isolated institutional authority that had allowed Morwell to operate without accountability for 16 years. The law was hailed as a significant step forward in child protection, and advocates hoped that it would serve as a model for other states, though cynics noted that legislation passed in response to historical atrocities rarely prevented new variations of the same evil from emerging in different forms. But the story of the Innocence Garden home did not end with the memorial dedication or the passage of protective legislation, because there were aspects of what had happened in Grey Hollow that resisted neat resolution or rational explanation. In 2003, a botanist from the University of Massachusetts named Dr. Sarah Chen was conducting research on invasive plant species in coastal New England when she noticed unusual white flowers growing wild near the old foundation of the Ashworth estate, in the area where the garden had once stood before the contaminated soil was removed. The flowers should not have been there. The entire site had been excavated down to bedrock and filled with clean earth, but somehow these plants had returned, and when Dr. Chen examined them closely, she realized they were the same species that had been described in the forensic reports from 1981, a variety that should not exist in Massachusetts's climate and which appeared in no botanical database or seed catalogue. She collected samples and brought them back to her laboratory for analysis, and what she found disturbed her enough that she published a paper describing the flowers' unusual characteristics, particularly their root systems, which extended down more than 8 feet into the soil, far deeper than any normal flowering plant, as if they were searching for something buried beneath the surface. The discovery reignited public interest in the case and sparked debates about whether the flowers were simply a hardy invasive species that had survived the remediation efforts, or whether they represented something more disturbing, some legacy of Morwell's work that persisted in the biology of the plants themselves. Some people in Grey Hollow, particularly older residents who remembered the whispered stories about the orphanage, began to say that the garden still feeds, that the flowers were still drawing sustenance from suffering somehow embedded in the land itself, and while these claims were dismissed by scientists as superstition, there remained an uneasiness about the site that kept most people away even decades after the crimes had been exposed. Others argued that the persistence of the flowers was not supernatural but simply a reminder, a story that communities tell themselves to maintain vigilance against the kinds of evil that flourish in darkness and silence, evil that does not announce itself with dramatic violence but rather hums quietly like a lullaby, soothing and familiar until you realize too late what it has been hiding. The question that the Innocence Garden home forces us to confront is not whether monsters like Dr. Elias Morwell exist, because history has proven beyond any doubt that they do, individuals who possess the education and intelligence and social standing to hide their cruelty behind professional credentials and noble-sounding theories. The real question is how many such monsters are operating right now, in institutions and organizations that we trust, hiding behind good intentions and progressive language, while exploiting the powerless in ways that will only become visible decades from now, when someone finally looks closely enough to see what has been done. Morwell believed he was saving children by breaking them. He built a garden on their graves and called it progress, and he died believing that his work would continue long after his death, and perhaps in some way he was right, not because his specific methods persisted, but because the underlying conditions that enabled his crimes, the isolation of vulnerable populations, the deference to authority, the willingness to look away when looking closely would be uncomfortable, these conditions continue to exist wherever power is concentrated and oversight is weak. The white flowers that still bloom near the old foundation may be nothing more than an unusual botanical curiosity, or they may be exactly what the old residents of Grey Hollow believe them to be, a warning growing from poisoned ground, a reminder that evil does not always scream and rage. Sometimes it speaks softly and smiles gently, and promises to make broken things whole. And by the time you understand what it really is, it has already planted its roots too deep to be easily removed. What do you think? Could this happen again?